My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. And I am joined today by Leah Hunt-Hendrix. She has co-founded and led two national organizations, Solidaire and Way to Win. She also studied Solidarity at Princeton University, where she earned a PhD in religion, ethics, and politics. She's now the co-author with the wonderful Astra Taylor, who was recently on the program to talk about the age of insecurity. Leah Hunt-Hendrix is the co-author of the new book, Solidarity, the Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea. Leah Hunt-Hendrix, welcome to Current Affairs.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Now, you point out in this book something that I didn't notice until you pointed out in this book, which is that the concept of justice, of democracy, of fairness, of equality, liberty, these things have a voluminous academic literature on them. There are theorists of these concepts who debate endlessly what it would take to, what criteria we measure the satisfaction of justice by. I studied political philosophy as an undergraduate, and I remember our political philosophy classes were full of discussion about the just relationship of the person to the state and all that. And one of the things that you argue in this book is that this concept of solidarity is equally important and not nearly as much discussed.
Exactly. Yeah, I also studied political philosophy as an undergraduate. And at the same time, I started getting involved in some community organizing. I was involved in the living wage campaign that was happening on the campus then. And then I went on to graduate school and simultaneously continued being involved in activism and social movements. And in that world, solidarity is always thrown around. People sign their emails in solidarity. I got one
Right.
today.
We sing the song, Solidarity Forever.
Exactly. But in the stacks of the bookshelves in the libraries, there's very, very little. And so I started to wonder, why has this concept been neglected? And, the French motto of the revolution was liberty, equality, and fraternity. And some French scholars went on to say solidarity seems to be the heir apparent of this idea of fraternity. And it's used frequently, but it hasn't received as much attention. And Léon Bourgeois, who we quoted at the beginning, said, could this even be did the rise of the idea of solidarity in the 1800s signify the development of an entirely new idea? So I thought that was so interesting. And as I began to explore the history of the concept, I found an article that traced it back to ancient Rome, where it was a concept of mutually held debts and solidarity debts. And it goes from there, it gets translated into when the French adopted some of Roman law through the Napoleonic codes, it got transferred into French legal thought. And from there, almost by analogy, got transferred into the political discourse, that we have debts to each other. And so we should perhaps pay taxes. We should perhaps have some kind of social insurance. We should have some public goods because we owe this to each other and we owe it to the future generations. And we've inherited so much from past generations. And so this notion of collective debts and solidarity being our repayment of those debts became actually part of the founding of the welfare state, part of the justification for that. And so I thought, wow, this is such a rich history and yet is so under-discussed. And so we felt like it was worth spending some time to just kind of recover that history and lift up that thought.
Yeah, it's incredible. You have, in the book, you say that, in the 19th century, this concept really flourished. This was really used by a lot of people. And you say to the point where, I love this quote, the concept of solidarity became as ubiquitous as smokestacks and steamships in the 19th century. And you quote a French writer in 1914, say that now, these days, not a book, newspaper, meeting address, or formal speech is given in which the word solidarity is not repeated. So this idea at one point really flourished, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. There was even a group called the Solidarists, almost a political group, and they were part of organizing towards the welfare state. Emil Durkheim was part of that. He's thought of as kind of a founding sociologist, and he wrote a book on the division of labor in society where he breaks down his concept of solidarity. The big question at the time was, it's the Industrial Revolution. The grip of the church is being challenged. But so what can hold us together with the decline of God and King? And so many people, Durkheim among them, thought, okay, what is going to hold us together? And Durkheim was kind of optimistically believed that maybe the division of labor and the interdependence of we each make a different widget in the factory, and that would somehow hold us together, or make it clear that we were interdependent and we had duties to each other. And over the course of his life, he became less optimistic about that.
As you might.
Yeah. But that was the question at the time. And solidarity was raised as a potential solution, that perhaps we needed to construct solidarity in new ways, given the decline of these previous systems.
So help us better understand what it really is, this idea. You mentioned this idea of a collective debt. You mentioned a kind of interdependence. As I understand it from reading your book, it's also a concept that stands in contrast to ideas that divide human beings into groups, racism, hierarchy, nationalism, individualism. Solidarity is kind of the counterpoint to these, as some people are saying that creating others, other people are saying that we need to unify with others and recognize that we are all bound up in something. But I'm sure you can articulate this better than I can.
Well, I think solidarity in its most basic sense is a neutral term. It's just the way a group holds together. And so that can be positive or negative. And we mark out the idea of reactionary solidarity, where it's like to like. It's based on shared race, shared class, ruling class solidarity, white supremacist solidarity, versus what we call transformative solidarity, which is trying to extend the bounds of a collective identity to be broader and more inclusive. And in that historical kind of philosophical tradition we lay out, the idea of solidarity is about creating a collectivity that has some difference within it. It's not unity necessarily. So yeah, it's always doing the work of creating new collectivities, but those can be more exclusive, exclusionary, or more inclusive.
Yeah, help us understand then, you survey the history of solidarity in practice across various movements, from abolitionism to anti-colonial struggles to the US labor movement. But as you've mentioned, there is a kind of solidarity in nationalism, which is, I see my fate as bound up with those that I consider to be in my particular group. And you distinguish there this idea of transformative solidarity, which you are interested in profiling. So tell us a little bit more about, if we take an activist movement that you consider to embody this idea of transformative solidarity, what characteristics would the activist group that give it that transformative solidarity, or mean that it embodies that?
Well, I probably got my real start in activism during Occupy Wall Street, which many people may not even remember was 13 years ago.
It's a while back now. Yeah.
It was a while back. And that's actually where Astra and I met as well. And Occupy was this wild eruption that had a focus on class inequality and wanted to raise class back as part into the national discussion. And it had a really interesting framework where of the 99 versus the 1%. And that was a really intentional construction of collective identity, saying 99% of us have something in common. And the 1% is really who we don't have a lot in common with.
Sure.
So it invited people to come together across all sorts of their professional backgrounds, racial backgrounds, national backgrounds, and to see themselves as unified in this way, or as part of a shared political project. It's interesting because there was another formulation during Occupy, which was the occupier. And the occupier was the person who like slept at the encampment. And it was such a higher bar. It was hard to be an occupier. It was hard. Not many people had the time or ability to do that. And so you can see right there that in a single social movement, there were a couple different identities that were constructed, one that was more inclusive and one that was more exclusive. And so I think it's sort of an invitation for people who are involved in organizing today to think about how you construct your identities, your group identities. And there's a tendency to want to be narrow and to want to have kind of the purest and most hardcore be the focal point. But that ends up leaving us with social movements that are pretty thin and weak, to be honest. And so I think raising the concept again of solidarity is an invitation to think about, like, how do we actually build broad-based mass movements?
It is striking when you think back to Occupy Wall Street, and we now, obviously, they were so successful in getting that slogan, the 99% versus the 1%, into the discourse that we kind of take for granted. These things, you hear something enough times, it loses its sense of being remarkable. But when you go back and you draw attention to it, you think about what it meant to say, in a country where we are infamously politically and economically and divided in so many ways, to say, well, hang on a minute, let's have the largest possible group of people who have a shared interest and have them work together. It really is quite powerful. And I always think your book is obviously goes, tries to tease out what this means as an idea. But I think a lot of people experience this very much as just a feeling that when you felt it. And if you really feel it, it can send chills down you. Like I felt that at Occupy Wall Street. I felt that incredible sense of people, such different people coming together around things. And I felt it again when I think you quote in this book, Bernie Sanders saying, fight for someone you don't know and fight for someone who doesn't have the same problems that you do, but you feel this powerful sense of solidarity with them.
Yeah, there is something incredibly powerful about collective action, and especially in a society where that's so focused on the individual and so focused on celebrity or the social media influencer or the individual entrepreneur. It's rare that we get to really feel that like effervescence of taking action together. And it's so powerful. And of course, you mentioned, in your question about the history of this, nationalism has that element to it. There can be that kind of nationalist, patriotic effervescence, and that can lead people to war and is often stoked by creating an other. Benedict Anderson was someone that we drew on also in the book, who writes about nationalism and how is it that we all feel American? We don't know each other. What do we have in common? So that national identity is something that's created and sustained through different practices and rituals, things that are very mundane, like going to the DMV or getting your driver's license, but also through media. He talks a lot about the role of media in creating that sense of national identity. And I think that that's one of our real challenges today, is that our media landscape is so divisive as opposed to creating a context that unifies.
Yeah.
And not to say that nationalism is the kind of solidarity that, we lift up as goal, but people do need to feel like they're a part of some kind of collective project.
Yeah, which can be used, as we said, for good and for ill, depending on who's considered to be inside the relevant group and outside the relevant group. But this idea of, seeing yourself as having a shared interest with other people, even if their struggle is not exactly your own, has been, really important in some of the most powerful movements of the last 100 years. I mean, when you go back to abolitionism and you look at people like John Brown, who were, obviously not enslaved himself, or you look at, you cite Friedrich Engels, who he came from wealth, son of a factory owner, why does he need to be involved in the struggle for socialism? It's not going to benefit him personally, financially. In fact, Engels had to, subsidize Karl Marx his whole life for this. So, but people who feel that strong sense of identification with others and that interdependence to where, they have to act regardless of whether it is going to bring immediate personal benefit to them. Let's talk about this idea of the problems with philanthropy, because you write a lot in the book about the differences between types of support, right? So, you talk about how, you can be an ally who supports a movement on the basis of your feelings of personal guilt, but has a sort of patronizing attitude towards it. And you write about philanthropy where the philanthropist makes you go through the history of like Rockefeller and Carnegie and all these people who believe on some level that they want to better the lives of others, but who lack what you describe as solidarity. So tell us more about how solidarity would look different from those other approaches that still profess to want to elevate and help people.
Yeah, so we call those semblances of solidarity,
Okay.
things like
Yes.
altruism and charity, benevolence. Even the word benevolence, like the good
Sure.
will, but it's one person's will towards another. And so, like, one very prominent movement these days in philanthropy is called effective altruism.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And so, the concept of altruism also has a sort of singular, it's about like your moral purity in a way. And whereas solidarity is really relational, it's about both people being active agents and protagonists, not one person being the donor and the other the recipient. So there's a way in which philanthropy can be dominating, and it can really impose the will of the philanthropist on the grantee. A lot of my early experience in this field, I would notice funders would offer a grant to an organization on the condition that they use it for X, Y, or Z project. And the organization would quietly say, that's not really what we wanted to do. Or, that actually like pulls us away from our core work. And it could have the power to change the mission of the organization. And so I have been interested, but, we can go on and critique philanthropy, but the fact is we also are in a situation where most nonprofit organizations need funding. And unless you have sort of the union model of membership dues, which I highly recommend that people focus on membership, there's a role potentially for philanthropy, but we have to be very careful about those dynamics.
I think about this a lot, actually, because, I run a nonprofit media organization, Current Affairs, and we've stayed small rather than solicit money because we're so worried that, everything comes with hidden strings. So we've tried to build, a subscriber model where we're funded by the subscribers, and we build a community of people who are supporting the magazine, because we're so worried that if someone comes along dangling a big check, they say, oh, well, we promise no editorial interference. But then all of a sudden, it turns out that there's a little bit of editorial interference. So, there really are different models where, and it's not to say that that's not support, right? As you say, you're distinguishing between, what kinds of support are you giving to people? And are you recognizing, are you approaching people as equals? It seems to be a really important part of solidarity. Do we all feel like bound together, with everyone contributing?
Yeah, and see our fates as intertwined. Like the effective altruist may send malaria nets to countries in Africa, but there isn't necessarily a sense in which, like, what were the dynamics that created the situation where malaria continues to exist in Africa and not here? What potentially was our role was the US's role in that? There's a real evacuation of politics and of power and of history, and just a sense of, I have these resources now and I can give them away, but the recipient is not seen as like an agent who have decision-making power or political agency.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program.
As I mentioned earlier, you obviously define and theorize solidarity in the book, but it is one of those things that you kind of know when you see, and that is best understood through seeing examples of it in action. And I've thought we're recording this just a few days after the young Air Force member, Aaron Bushnell, self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy to protest the Gaza genocide. And it was interesting because obviously that's an extreme step to take. But what struck me in relation to, as I was reading your book and I was thinking about this guy, is that he's not Palestinian. I don't know that he has Palestinian relatives, but he is a person who saw himself, his fate as bound up with whatever happens to Gaza. He saw himself as complicit. He said he felt complicit. He said he had a debt. And it's a rare person who kind of feels that way. But that does seem to be kind of the core of what that solidarity is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that we are all complicit in the actions of our government. And our government is currently funding Israel's war on Gaza. And there are many, many people, Jewish Americans and Jewish Israelis, who have expressed real solidarity and are doing so much to try to bring about a ceasefire. We were recently in a conversation with A Land for All, which is one group of Israelis and Palestinians who are putting forward a kind of proposal for a peace. There's a group called Standing Together. I actually spent about 3 years living in the Middle East after college, and I had felt complicit in the war in Iraq. And I felt like I needed to go and to understand the consequences of the U.S. actions in the Middle East. And I spent a year in Egypt, a year in Syria, and then about a year between Israel and the West Bank. And the concept of solidarity was so profound there. And I think the war right now in Gaza is where we're seeing, it is just devastating, but the solidarity that we're seeing among many Jewish Americans and Israelis is really beautiful.
I do feel like in the United States, you are kind of, I don't know, you're not told explicitly it's okay not to care about other people. But if you don't care about other people, you can do pretty well in life here. There are plenty of people who go through life not noticing the consequences of U.S. foreign policy, for instance. It doesn't enter their consciousness. And partly that's because the media is not, when we waged war in Iraq, there was very little attention paid to Iraqi lives. But there are some people, and it's usually a minority of people, who do. They feel that sense of, well, what is it that Eugene Debs said? While there's a lower class, I'm in it. And while there's a soul in prison, I am not free. And I love that quote as the kind of clearest embodiment possible. It's not like he can get out of prison, but he still feels that so long as one person is in prison, he's not free.
Well, there is a sense in which it is true that it's a bit of an illusion that we're not all impacted by our foreign policy or by the exploitation of other people within our borders. Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, talks a lot about why we don't have public pools anymore is because of fundamentally racism and white people not wanting to swim with Black people. Maybe it feels like we can get by, but we don't have a functioning healthcare system. Our education system is in disarray. There's a lot of ways in which, and then of course, the money that is spent, the billions and billions of dollars that we spend abroad that could instead be spent on public goods at home or on repayment of debts that I think that we owe abroad, like climate debts. So we are all impacted by these decisions. And it's just a question of whether we choose to observed that impact or not.
Well, it's interesting because, in some ways you think of solidarity as the antithesis of self-interest and individualism. But on the other hand, there is a way in which solidarity is in our self-interest, because I certainly found that the Bernie Sanders campaign, with everyone coming together to work on this project with this inspiring vision of what we could achieve together, yes, it's true that you were fighting for people you didn't know. And even if you didn't have student debt, you believed that student debt was an injustice. It was also true that in a country so lonely and atomized as this one, even if you didn't have the particular problems that were being addressed by the public policy, being part of a solidaristic movement is just totally transforms your life. You meet people, you get to know people, you have experiences you never would have had, and you don't sit alone scrolling through the news.
Yeah. No, I think there is a real aspect of self-interest to solidarity. Danielle Allen says, that there's not just self-interest full stop, but she talks about rivalrous self-interest versus equitable self-interest. And rivalrous self-interest is very focused on competition and zero sum. But equitable self-interest is, the ways in which we all benefit from each other benefiting. So I benefit from having a community that is healthy, that is safe, that's thriving. And so it really is more of a concept of how we lift all boats, but seeing yourself in the boat as well.
Yeah. Not to dwell too much on your own personal experience, but you are someone who grew up in a way that you could have not participated in social movements. You made a choice, and I assume you feel like that sense that it would have been impossible to have a satisfying life personally if you hadn't taken the path that you did.
Yeah. I sort of began to recognize race and class when I was in middle school. We moved from New York to rural New Mexico. And that's where I began to realize what all the very different ways that people live. And over time, I realized how just depressed, and my friends in New York were antidepressants, struggling with cocaine use, in the hospital because of anorexia, just driven almost mad by the kind of pressures of perfection and wealth. And it became clear to me from that time that people are really struggling on both ends of the spectrum because of this level of inequality and the isolation that it creates. So for me, it's always felt like I do this work. My work focuses on economic inequality, and I do this because I want to live in a world that's more equal, and I want my children to live in that world. And I think we all just need to do the work to get there.
Yeah. I want to conclude by talking about the demands that solidarity places on us, because obviously we've talked about how activist movements succeed through this kind of transformative solidarity, the development of this concept. But I want to just talk about a couple of the implications, because one of the things that you point out that is, I don't want to say provocative, but does challenge readers is you don't obviously endorse the panic over cancel culture, but you do say toward the end of the book, and on the left, we need to be careful about the tendency to call out and denounce and to, cast people out of our movements for their transgressions. Obviously, you have to have your lines of what, who you will and won't have in your movement. But, an organizing approach, a solidaristic approach, requires a great deal of empathy. And, you challenge social justice movements and progressive activists to make sure that the idea of solidarity is real. It's not just a word, but it's not necessarily easy, right? to show solidarity.
Yeah, definitely we need accountability and to have lines and to help people change when they cross those lines. But I think our movements can be quick to be exclusive. And I think they would be stronger if we really think about how to be welcoming, how to be hospitable, how to bring people in. I think the left can tend to self-marginalize and just feel unapproachable. And I also, to just give another personal experience, I was raised evangelical, and recently went back to visit my parents in Dallas, and we went to church, just First Baptist Dallas, where the pastor is a Trump acolyte.
Sure.
But the church has quadrupled in size, I think, from the time when I was there as a teenager. And right when you walk in the door, there are greeters just pulling you in and telling you about all the things that you can sign up for, the singles group, the men's group, the parents group. And it's a very welcoming place.
Yeah, that's what we need.
Of course, I don't endorse their theology or philosophy or politics, but I think there is something to learn from that. And then also like how we let people make mistakes and learn and grow and keep people engaged. I think a lot of people on the left struggle also with burnout after being in the movement for a while, and because the standards are high and the work is long. And so how do we become a movement that is nourishing and that's healing, even that's that's rejuvenating, and that makes people want to come back for more? So I think that's the challenge.
That's right. We think about that a lot at Current Affairs because we put out a left magazine. Obviously, when you're putting out a left magazine, you can be very depressing because you're covering a lot of horror and injustice. So we're like, well, how can we also give them happiness? How can we also give them hope? How can we also make them, want to continue every day and feel like they're being heard? And that's tough because you're trying to write about really serious stuff a lot of the time, but you're conscious that you run the risk of making your audience feel the world is bleak. And I love those. I agree with you on this, like looking at the phrase I've used before is like, we need an evangelical left. That is a left that goes out and tries to find new people and bring them in and bring them to our game night, and we'll have game night. It'll be about the game, but we'll also talk to you a little bit about socialism. I think that's really important because, and I recently wrote an article about 1930s New Masses magazine. It was incredible. They used to have like socialist dance nights and, and book clubs and all sorts of things to bring people in. And the other thing when you were talking that struck me was, I remember Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment about Trump voters. It struck me at the time that it was entirely the wrong approach to speaking about people whose politics you might loathe, but who you want to sit down with and go, well, look, tell me why you think Donald Trump, this billionaire, is going to actually help you out. Instead of this approach that's like, these people are just, I can't talk to these people.
Yeah, we do believe that there's a place for polarization. We do have opponents and enemies, but making sure that we identify the right ones. And it's not each other. It's not usually the person who's right next to you who made a mistake. It's usually Elon Musk or Bill Ackman. It's people. It's like,
yes, he doesn't get invited, but everyone else.
We don't have to invite them. But yeah, no, I think we need to think about who actually has power and who is benefiting from us being divided from each other, and how do we stay united to challenge that? Yeah.
But I would say that even Bill Ackman is invited to come and join the left if he wants to change his ways, shed his bad habits, and repent. There's always room.
His daughter sounds great. I think we should find his daughter.
Well, a lot of these billionaires have kids who sound like they're pretty cool.
Because they realize what's wrong with how it is at the top.
Right. Let's just one final thing here, because I want to go to your conclusion, and you talk about the virtues that accompany this solidarity, and you recognize in the book that we don't talk much necessarily on the left about virtues. This term that's associated with Aristotle, this idea that we should cultivate particular traits within ourselves. I certainly don't hear that much but you say it's important that solidarity does require us to look within ourselves, to think about who we are, and to try and embody these virtues that you list. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are constantly being formed as people. We're by our environments, by the things that we do every day, by what we give our attention to. And so it's worth thinking, and, by the habits we develop. And I'm sure many of your listeners think about how they might become better writers, better athletes, better at whatever they want to pursue. So I think we all do understand that, it takes work to cultivate different kinds of skills and sensibilities. And I think that's true also of our moral sensibilities about how we treat each other and just the kind of people we are in the world. There are some debates in political philosophy about, let's just create a just system so that we don't have to worry if we have bad people. But I don't think that works. I think that
Yeah.
we're always creating ourselves, part of what society does is cultivate certain kinds of people. And that's part of what capitalism does. It cultivates us as consumers. So I think just becoming aware of that and realizing we have some control over what qualities we want to cultivate in ourselves is important. And yes, in the past, if religious traditions have done this, and if you have a religious tradition, maybe that's something that you think about. But for many people who don't have a tradition, I think there is an opportunity to think about this in a secular way of just what kind of person you want to be in the world. And so I recently read Mark Andreessen's Techno-Optimist Manifesto.
I read about that, the Techno-Optimist Manifesto. Oh my good God, yeah.
And it's interesting because he too lists the kind of values. He doesn't call them virtues, he calls them values that to cultivate. And his are things like aggression, strength, ambition, relentlessness. And so you can see your choice of which virtues to cultivate matters. And things like humility and hospitality and courage, I think are things that we want to try to intentionally foster.
I actually liked that he published it because so rarely
rather have it be explicit.
Do you get things said so explicitly? I spend my time trying to convince people that this is what these guys believe, and the guy comes out and goes, "This is what I believe." You go, okay, well, there it is.
It's helpful, yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think is so valuable about your book is that it articulates something that, as I say, for a lot of us is a kind of amorphous feeling. We feel when we hear something like that Debs quote or the Bernie Sanders thing, we think, there's something that touches you in some way. But what you do, and I think what valuable writing does so often, is to take something that is felt and find a way to articulate it in words and to sort of be more precise about what we're talking about. And then you go through all these examples and you make these distinctions between the different kinds of solidarity, the kind we need, and then the kind that actually, the kind of narrow provincial solidarity that might actually be an important part of very bad things. And, what it takes for individuals to display solidarity, what it can achieve. So I recommend that our listeners and readers pick up the book Solidarity, the Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea by Leah Hunt-Hendrix and Astra Taylor. Leah Hunt-Hendrix, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you. It was good to be here.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.